Hi guys, and welcome to the second to last week of Hello Future Live. We're going to be focusing on study skills this week. So I'm Abby, I'm the graduate intern for the Furness area, and joined with us today we have Chris from Edge Hill, who's going to give you some really useful tips on how to study well.
Thanks very much, Abby. So my name's Chris. I'm from Edge Hill University and I'm an education liaison manager. So what I'll talk through in this presentation is some really helpful tips to assist you with your study skills, not only for now, whilst you're currently in year 12 or year 13, but also how that's going to help you for when you actually start university and the transition to university as well. So what I'll do now is I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you'll all be able to see my slideshow that's currently on the screen. So as I say, I'll talk a little bit about what you can do now within sixth form or college, especially around the topics of things like time management, revising, researching and referencing. But then I'll also talk about how what you're doing now can really benefit you for university, but also some really good tips about how can you help yourself prepare study skill wise for starting university, whether that's this coming September or whether that's the following September as well. So just as a thought, as a starting point, I thought I'd mention where Edge Hill is, because some of you may know where Edge Hill is, some of you may not. So we're not too far away from wherever you are based in Cumbria. It's not too far, so about an hour and a half, an hour and 45, depending on the place that you live. And if you were coming by train, it's a really easy change in Preston. So from anywhere across Cumbria, if you get the train to Preston, you can change nice and easily to Ormskirk. And we're a campus university. So this is what we look like from above. So you can see that kind of what I mean by campus is that everything is in the one place. So your accommodation, your lecture theatres, your sports facilities, your library, it's only 5 or 10 minutes walk from each other. So we'll start with independent study, everybody. And this is a really big thing to try and get used to now whilst you're at sixth form or college, but something that will become a lot more prevalent when you start university. And basically what I mean by saying independent study is working on your own with very limited supervision or external input. So it might be that currently you might be writing an assignment for your A-level or BTEC and doing research around it. It might be reading around a particular subject to then write your personal statement, or it might be about your revision for exams. That is all examples of independent study. And actually why it's important is that allows you to succeed in the studies that you're currently doing, but it also allows you to produce really high quality applications or perform really well, especially if you're looking at university or future job prospects. But also, if you're thinking about university, it really helps you prepare for higher education, because that is something that will become a lot more prevalent when you start at university, being able to go off, manage your own time, organize your own deadlines, and be able to research and write those particular assignments at university. So the more you can practice that now, the better it will be in the long run. So how can you help that independent study whilst you're currently at sixth form or college? So think about starting on these particular skills, and we'll talk a bit in more detail over the next couple of slides. But think about how can you improve your time management? How can you improve your revising techniques? How can you look at researching? How can you look at referencing as well, which might be quite new to a few of you particularly. And if you can try and do that and improve that independent learning whilst you're at sixth form or college, that will really benefit you, as I've mentioned, for then going on to higher education study, but also for the job sector as well, if you're just going straight into a job or an apprenticeship instead. So first of all, time management. So for some of you, you might be absolutely brilliant at this. And for some of you, you might be absolutely terrible. So I know, for example, me, I'm really keen to make sure that I manage my time really well. So actually 45% of employers felt their staff needed an upskill in terms of their time management. So actually that was being able to prioritize particular tasks was a skill that a lot of employers found that their staff didn't have. So actually, the sooner you can start it now at your age, the better that it's going to be for future. So thinking about investing in your time and what works for you. So I know for me, just writing a simple list and actually putting a prioritization into that list. So what do I need to do first? what is a deadline that's coming up? Do I need to get off that quickly? Have I not got a couple of weeks to plan that? And obviously you could integrate that into kind of a calendar or a diary. So that might be a physical calendar or diary, or something attached to your Gmail or your Outlook, for example, that you can kind of prioritize your particular time. Or you could use a particular tool. So something that's really good is something called the Action Priority Matrix. So if you Google that, it'll come up with kind of a really good way of filling in that matrix if that particularly works for you. So in terms of if you want to be successful at time management, you've got to think about 3 questions. So work out what, work out for how long, and work out when. So if you follow those 3 simple words, you'll find that your time management becomes a lot more simpler and a lot more effective as well. So what about revisions? So especially if you're currently in year 13, that might be particularly high on the agenda at the moment. If you have any exams coming up or due to take place. But in terms of revision wise, think about everybody's different. We as humans are all totally different in the way that we learn things and take things in. And that's a great thing. So for each of you, you'll all have your own learning styles. And what I'm sure a lot of you will have found is that when you moved up from GCSE to A-level and BTEC, some methods that you might have used then actually don't work as well for A-level and BTEC. So you might have had to find a different way of doing that. So a good way of kind of starting, or the starting point to think about for revision, is think about, could you use any online resources to actually help find out what your learning style is? Because what you might find is that the learning style you thought was best for you isn't actually the best one. So that could be something worth having a look at before you even start your revision. But also starting a timetable. So a lot of you may have done that previously and set a revision timetable. That's the easiest way of preparing for what's to come. Now, in terms of learning styles, as I mentioned, everybody's very, very different in terms of how they learn, which is a great thing. But it's really important that you know actually how your learning style works and what's best for you. So according to some researchers, so Fleming and Mills, they came up with the VARC model. So this is basically putting everybody into these 4 different learning styles. So you're either visual, which means that you prefer kind of graphics and symbolic ways of representing information. You might be oral, which means you preferred hearing information. That's your best way of learning. It might be read and write, which is R. So that's kind of obviously reading off information that's printed. Or it might be kinesthetic, whereby you learn by doing, so through practice and experience. So to give you some examples of that and what might help, obviously, as I mentioned, doing things like questionnaires and quizzes to find out that learning style can really help. And then going away, think about some suggestions that you could use for whatever learning style you come out with. So if you are visual, think about things like mind maps or diagrams or flowcharts or posters. If you prefer to listen or prefer to hear that kind of feedback and knowledge, and you learn best that way, then things like making or listening to recordings, creating a song, or watching YouTube videos, or maybe group division as well, that can really help, particularly. If you prefer to kind of read or write, so the information that's in front of you, things like notes or flashcards or post-its around the house. I did that when I was doing my GCSEs, put various post-its across the house. So when I went to the fridge, I remembered sort of a particular example or a particular synonym, for example, for English. So little things like that can really help. Or even things like making essay plans or creating PowerPoints. But also if you're kinesthetic, so if you prefer to learn by doing, things like acting out concepts, so through role plays, making videos, relating concepts to examples or case studies, or even past paper questions. So for whatever learning style you are, there's lots of really different ways of being able to improve your revision, but also make it that bit more interesting as well. In terms of tips for revision, so the key is really making sure that you revise to the method that best suits you. So whether that's reading notes, whether it's past papers, whether it's a combination of different things, do what's best for you as a student. Obviously, past papers are really good, no matter what learning style you prefer. Past papers are always really good, and the mark scheme is great as well to actually understand where people have gained the more increased marks, where maybe people have fell down. So that's a really good way of kind of gauging your answers and doing that revision. But make sure you look after yourself as well. So the key to revision is not just doing as much as you can all the time. It's making sure that you look after yourself and your brain. So take regular exercise, take regular breaks. Also make sure that you talk to people as well. So if you're anxious about anything, talk to your people at home or your friends about it. Give yourself rewards as well. So something I used to do, I always used to reward myself with a chocolate bar, for example, if I'd done a certain number of hours of revision, or reward myself with a TV program or something like that. So make sure that you do look after yourself, because that's just as important as the revision that you're doing. But also there's some really good useful apps nowadays. I'm sounding really old now, but sort of back when I was doing my revision, we didn't have apps for revision. We just had to do it kind of via paper. So utilize some really useful apps. So things like Gojimo is excellent, but also Get Revising and Flipped, which will all be available on various app stores. Now, what about research, everyone? So with research, as you may have found already within your A-level or BTEC studies, there is absolutely a wealth of information from a wealth of different sources, either on the internet or within libraries or in paper form. So especially when you come towards university, and probably sometimes now whilst you're doing A-level and BTEC, your research skills are going to be really important for writing a particular essay or constructing a particular assignment. But equally, it's going to be just as important if you're currently in year 12 and preparing to write your personal statement, or if you're in year 13 and actually going for an interview for a job or apprenticeship, for example. So for some assignments, marks may also be awarded slightly differently if you've included a lot of variety of research. So that's something to think about, especially for university study. And when I talk about information sources, there's lots of different ones. So it could be through books, it could be films that you've watched or documentaries, it could be journal articles, it could be newspapers, it could be blogs, it could be conference notes, it could even be interviews or websites as well. So there's not just one form of information source. You nowadays have a wealth of information and sources to read up on. But what I will say about sources is that you've really got to make sure that you're looking at where that source has come from. So there was a study by Holman Rector who talked about Wikipedia. So they stated from their study that comparing Wikipedia with other encyclopedias for historical articles found that Wikipedia had a 20% inaccuracy rate for those articles. So what's really important, even though that research was carried out kind of a good number of years ago, it highlights that actually, especially when you're researching online, think about the source that it's coming from. So particularly if it's something like Wikipedia, anybody can edit that. So actually, how do you know that information is truthful and correct? But also remember that when you search something on Google, it doesn't actually bring up the same results for you as it might do for your friend, because it's synthesized with cookies to make sure that obviously you're looking at various things that are interested to you. So think about the quality of the source, especially online, that you may be doing, either for your current studies or when you go into university study. And actually think about the reliability, so the quality of that source, but how reliable is it as well? So some things to ask that are really important are things like, if there's facts and figures referenced, where have they come from? So if they come from a national report, for example, or a particular really essential source, have you found that actually who the author is or the publisher, or it's actually from an organization that you know? Do they seem legitimate? Think about website policies as well. So actually, even in the kind of the footer or the header, there might be some information about that website and where they gain their information from. Think about how recent the information is. So especially when you're coming to university study, the more recent the information, the better, because journals constantly evolve and change, and thoughts and processes are constantly changing. So have a look at actually how old that source is. But also think about who has written that source. So this is especially relevant with newspaper articles. So think actually, or who is the person who's actually written this article? Are they in favour of one discussion point more than the other, especially it's around the discussion topic? So particularly think about that for newspaper articles. So there's some really good questions to ask to check the validity of those sources. And in regards to the quality of source as well, think about the relevance. So actually, if you include irrelevant information, might actually mean that you would lose marks in a university assignment. So what's a really good way of doing, of helping that is, especially if you're using journal articles, try and read an extract or an abstract of a research paper to see actually, is it talking about the things that actually will be really relevant to include in my essay? But also be critical as well. So think about not just the reliability, but further questions to criticize that information source. So for example, if it was talking about some data or a sample of people, how many people have they used? So if it's like 100% people were satisfied, but they only asked 5 people, think about that sample source. Actually, is it better that they've used a bigger sample source? And also, what have they used in terms of research methodology? So is it peer reviewed, for example? Have they used a particular type of method to get that data? So be critical, especially when you're thinking about those questions to ask on the previous slide. And when you're finding source as well, a really good way of doing that is to use something called a STARS technique. So that is subjectivity, timeliness, authority, relevance, and supporting evidence. So always have that acronym in your mind when you're trying to find particular sources, and make sure that it meets all those STAR requirements. So obviously, in terms of finding sources, again, with the amount of information that you've got a really wide range of things to find sources on. So it might just be your school, college, or university library. It might be through Google Scholar. So actually, that's a range of literacy from a range of sources that you can just access on Google. It might be through Google Books. So you might be able to get access to particular books without having to pay for it that might not be in the library. Or also there's something called sweetsearch.com. And that's a really good for kind of a student search engine to find kind of any literacy or sources in particular. Now, in terms of referencing, so this is something that you may not have come across too much just yet, especially in A-level and BTEC, but it's something that will become a lot more prominent when you get to university or if you choose to go to university. So basically what referencing means is that when you're writing an essay or an assignment, any particular books or any particular websites or journals or articles that you've used, you have to say whether you've quoted directly from them or you've paraphrased from them. So you're basically acknowledging that you're using their information that they may have come up with or talked about. So it is really important whilst you're at school or college. So as I say, some of you might be doing it already, but it becomes even more important at university because that referencing enables you and shows whether you're school or college teachers or university lecturers, it shows you've researched that topic, but it also directs your readers to the information that you've used to kind of back up what you're saying. But a big thing, and the biggest thing, the reason why you use referencing is to avoid plagiarism. And I'll talk about that over the next couple of slides. But in terms of how to reference, there are loads of different ways that you can reference. There's loads of kind of referencing systems or models. So the one that you might have heard of, but the one that you'll probably most likely hear of at university is the Harvard referencing system. And generally, universities will ask you for a specific style of referencing. So obviously ask your teacher at the moment. Your teachers will obviously may ask you at the moment with your essays and assignments to reference in a particular way. And that might be slightly different to university. So obviously double check with your teacher at the moment as to what referencing system you are using at school or college. But generally when you reference, it consists of 2 parts. So you'll have to have an in-text citation. So for example, when you're writing your essay, within your essay, you would kind of quote the authors, for example, of whatever article or book you're quoting from. And then you also have to have a full reference list at the end as well. Okay, so it's kind of in 2 parts of how referencing works. But also, as I mentioned before about apps, there's some really good free software that can kind of help you to reference. So Zotero and Mendeley are really good little softwares to access to help that reference. And a big thing that I'm going to say to you now, and something that I massively underestimated, is how long it takes to write a reference list. Some of you may have experienced this before, but for my dissertation at university, which is a huge piece of work, it's about 10 pages of references, and I left that till the very end, and it took me forever to do. So please make sure that when you do reference, whether that's now or whether that's at university, you keep referencing as you go. So if you've put a reference into your essay or assignment, make sure that you then put it in your reference list, and that just helps your time management, going back to what we mentioned before. Now, plagiarism, I touched upon this on one of the previous slides, but this is a big point of why you do referencing, especially at university, is to avoid plagiarism. So basically what plagiarism means is that if you use information from a source without acknowledging it, you could be accused of plagiarism. So it can be accidental. It's not always on purpose. Where you as a person, you might not have intended to pass the work off as your own, but it's really important that you don't do that. So any piece of work that you do, whether that's now in school or college, or whether that's at university, is always your own, because especially any form of plagiarism is unacceptable. So anything that you're making reference to in your assignment or essay could be something from a book, a journal, or a webcast. It could be something that you've heard from a radio broadcast, or it could be something that you've watched in a particular documentary. So you've got to acknowledge everything. So any information you're including from any of those information sources that we mentioned earlier, you have to reference to avoid being accused of plagiarism. Now, to give you an idea of what plagiarism looks like, I've got a couple of examples on the screen. So to give you an idea of kind of true or false around plagiarism, the first quote is, do you have to reference images, diagrams, and tables? Well, yes, you do. Okay, because that's obviously not your own work. You're taking it from somebody else, from an article or a journal, for example. If I paraphrase information, I don't need to reference, but direct quotes must always be referenced. And that's false. Okay, so obviously when you're referencing, you need to make sure you're including that reference within your essay or assignment text, and then you have to put it into your reference list as well. So it's really important that obviously when you're paraphrasing information, that you need to make sure that anything that you're doing, whether that's direct quotes or indirect quotes, you're still referencing it within your assignment. If you use multiple ideas from one author in my assignment, as long as the source is in the reference list and the first idea is cited in the text, I shouldn't cite all our ideas individually in the text. And that's wrong, okay? Because what's really important is wherever you're using anybody's paraphrasing or quoting, you still have to reference it in your text. So for example, if the text is from Mullen, 2008, if you've used it once in your essay, maybe in the first paragraph, and then you use it again in your last paragraph, you'd still have to put Mullen 2008, okay? So you've got to make sure that you always reference, even if you've used that reference before. And then what about every source in my reference list should be referenced in exactly the same way so the format looks consistent? So that's wrong, okay? And the reason for that is because once you get to university, you'll have lots of really good support and help on how to reference and how you should do it. You normally get a guide or a little handbook. I know I did when I started university. But obviously, if you're quoting from a book or a website or a journal article, you write them slightly differently in your reference list. So that's why they won't look exactly the same. They'll look slightly different depending on whether it's a book or depending on whether it's a website. But obviously those university guides will help you. And obviously any referencing that you have to do now, school or college will probably provide you with a guide of how to reference as well. So if you're ever unsure, you can obviously always ask your teachers, or you can ask any library staff when you come to university as well, because they're really clued up on referencing, particularly around plagiarism. And obviously, remember those different types of sources. You need to reference it slightly differently, but that'll be provided in the university handbook. So I thought I'd finish on a little bit around making that transition to university in terms of your study skills. So the first thing to say is actually, especially thinking back of this year, when a lot of you have been based at home for your studies, actually that's going to really benefit you in a really positive way, because being at home and not being at school, those independent study skills have been even more enhanced than they would be at sixth form or college. So actually that's really going to help you come September or the following September. So actually these skills, you'll develop them over time. So as you get into university, they'll develop even further. But whatever university you're choosing to go to, you'll still get plenty of support. So it might be through workshops that the university offers as part of either a year, or it might be over this coming summer if you're starting in September, if you're currently in year 13. It might be through one-to-one appointments with some careers staff or library staff and learning services. It might be through library inductions, so you'll normally get one of those in your first week at university. But also you've got, as you would at sixth form or college, you've got a personal tutor who can help you on a day-to-day basis. But also you might have somebody who looks after a particular module or a particular year as well. Plus you've got any support for any disabilities that anybody might have. So especially around learning difficulties, every university has particular teams that are able to support with that, especially in terms of referencing or writing essays and assignments. And in terms of academic preparation, so obviously what you're doing at sixth form college now is fantastic prep for university. So that's what sixth form college have been doing with you the past year or two, around developing you to go on to that next level. But there are other ways on top of what you're doing at sixth form college that you can prepare yourself for future study. So it might be that you could actually have a reading list. So if you start in this coming September for university in year 13, keep an eye on your emails over the summer, because you might get a reading list from your chosen university. And that's a really good way of kind of keeping yourself in touch over the summer. So reading up around topics that you'll then be starting in September. But also universities may send you out resources or materials to help with the start of September, especially this year and the year that you've just had being in and out of school college. Universities are doing a lot more now to help support you over that summer period. But also in your first week, so in your induction week or your welcome week, some sessions might run in that week. So obviously there's lots going on socially, but don't forget about your academic things as well. So there might be some sessions you could go to that might help you prepare for things like time management or referencing or revision. And as I mentioned, there's plenty of support available. So with study skills, you are always developing and you're always learning. So make sure that you ask questions if needed. There's never a silly question, honestly, whether that's at school or college or whether that's at university. So speak to your school and college library teams, speak to your teachers as well and your form tutors or even your careers team. But also don't forget those personal sources. So people who are based at home, so your parents or guardians, or even your siblings or friends, they're able to help you with that support as well, especially around study skills and especially if they've been to university before or have experience of kind of further education too. But as I mentioned, especially with study skills, it's just as important to keep yourself healthy. So keeping your mental health as good as it can be. So there's some really good websites. So especially if you go on to Mind or Young Minds, there's some really great websites to help keep your mental health as good as it can be. Because as I say, that's just as important as it is being able to develop these study skills in particular. And just as I mentioned about referencing, because I've used a number of references through my study skills presentation, there is my reference list at the end. So there are all the references that I've used within this particular study skills presentation. So just to finish from me, thanks very much for listening. And I hope you found that session useful around study skills. Obviously, if you did want to find out a bit more about Edge Hill, you are more than welcome to. So you can either scan the QR code on the screen, or you can actually go straight to our website. And on there, you can chat to our current students, you can book an open day, or you can find out more about courses as well. And just finally is our open day dates on the screen. So we've got an open date this coming Saturday on the 12th of June, and then August, September, October, and November. And fingers crossed, come September and August time, we might be able to run more physical, traditional open days. But for now, they're based virtually, and most universities will be very similar. So thanks again. Hope you found it really useful, and good luck with your starting university in September or with your application for the following September as well.
Thanks for that, Chris. Some really useful advice in there. So this event has been put on as part of Hello Future Live. So we do have another study session on Wednesday, which will be myself and Rosa telling you some useful tips. And we're going to go over a few apps as well, like Chris has just mentioned there as well. So again, thank you very much for coming along. We hope you found this useful and hopefully see you in the next one, guys. Bye.